The words, a profound and persistent disappointment to the family name and a lifestyle fundamentally at odds with our core values, echoed in the sterile, overly lit conference room of my late father's solicitor, Mr. Abernathy. They were a direct quote from the codicil to my father, Arthur Thorne's will, a document he had apparently added just 6 months before his passing, explicitly and comprehensively disinheriting me, his only son. My name is Julian Thorne, 49 years old, and for the better part of 3 decades, my lifestyle, that of a quiet, unassuming, and openly gay man, a dedicated partner to my husband, David, for the past 22 years, had been a source of quiet, persistent disappointment to my father. This codicil, however, was a significant escalation from his usual passive-aggressive size and pointedly traditionalist pronouncements. This was a final, posthumous, and very public declaration of his disapproval, a last, bitter arrow fired from beyond the grave. My younger sister, Caroline, seated beside me, offered a performance of sisterly sympathy that was almost breathtaking in its insincerity. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on my arm, her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, now wide with feigned sorrow. "Oh, Julian," she'd murmured, her voice trembling with crocodile tears, "I had no idea that he could be so traditional, so harsh. This is just awful. Awful indeed. Particularly for her, I suspected, as the codicil went on to name her as the sole beneficiary of the entire Thorne family estate, a not insignificant portfolio of property, investments, and assets my father had spent a lifetime accumulating. My share, my birthright, was to be entirely and pointedly redirected to her, the normal child, the one who had provided him with 2 perfectly acceptable grandchildren and a respectable, if somewhat dull, son-in-law in the form of a mid-level banking executive named Gerald. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose legal career had been built on a foundation of dusty tradition and unwavering loyalty to my father, read the codicil with a distinct lack of any discernible emotion, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. When he had finished, he peered at me over his half-moon spectacles. "I am sorry, Julian," he'd said, his tone suggesting he was more sorry about the awkwardness of the situation than about the actual substance of my disinheritance. "Your father's instructions were quite specific." I simply nodded, my own expression, I hoped, equally unreadable. There was no point in arguing, no point in protesting. The document, however cruel, was likely legally sound. My father, whatever his personal failings, had always been a man of meticulous, if often misguided, planning. What Caroline, and indeed, what the late Arthur Thorne himself did not know, was that my own profession, my own lifestyle, had provided me with a rather unique and highly specialized set of skills. For the past 20 years, I have been a professional genealogist and historical researcher, a specialist in untangling complex family trees, uncovering hidden ancestries, and authenticating the provenance of historical bloodlines, often for high-net-worth individuals seeking to verify their claims to titles, estates, or in some cases, thrones. My work requires a forensic attention to detail, a deep understanding of archival research, and a certain creative flair for connecting seemingly disparate pieces of historical data. And for the past 5 years, ever since a chance discovery in a dusty parish record office during a routine client investigation, I have been quietly, methodically, and with a growing sense of almost cosmic irony, applying those skills to my own family tree, the illustrious Thorne family, whose name my father held so sacred, whose core values he had so cruelly used as a weapon against me. Tucked away in a secure, encrypted file on my laptop, a file codenamed Project Primogeniture, was a rather different version of the Thorne family legacy, a version supported not by bluster and prejudice, but by birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, and, most damningly, a series of discreetly obtained DNA comparison reports. A version that suggested that the direct bloodline my father so cherished was not nearly as direct or as pure as he had so arrogantly believed. His final act of homophobic bigotry, his attempt to erase me from our family's history, was about to trigger a rather comprehensive historical revision, one that would not just challenge his prejudices, but would, in fact, utterly demolish the very foundation upon which his entire sense of identity, his entire sense of superiority, was built. The gift I had in mind for my father's memorial service, a service Caroline was planning with her usual ostentatious flair, would not be a wreath of funereal lilies. It would be a beautifully bound, meticulously researched, and irrefutably documented genealogical report. A report that would, with quiet, devastating precision, reveal a truth about the Thorne family name that would make my own lifestyle choices pale in comparison. My father had wanted to cut me out of the will, to deny my place in his legacy. He had no idea that I, his profoundly disappointing son, held the key to a secret that would redefine that legacy, and indeed, the very definition of what it meant to be a Thorne forever. The historian was about to present his findings, and the family archives, I knew, would never be the same. The weeks following the reading of the will were a period of quiet, almost surreal, calm on my part, a stark contrast to the flurry of activity from my sister, Caroline. She, now the designated matriarch and sole inheritor of the Thorne family fortune, immediately began to enact her vision of what that legacy should look like. There were hushed, important-sounding phone calls with architects about sensitively modernizing our ancestral family home, a rambling, charmingly chaotic Tudor mansion my father had adored and which I knew Caroline secretly despised as drafty and impractical. There were meetings with wealth managers, with society decorators, with the organizers of the annual hospital charity ball, a committee she was now, as the new head of the Thorne family, clearly expecting to chair. My husband, David, a man whose quiet strength and unwavering support had been my anchor for over 2 decades, watched her machinations with a mixture of quiet anger and profound sympathy for me. "Are you just going to let her do this, Julian?" he'd asked me one evening, as I recounted Caroline's latest pronouncement about her plans to replace Dad's beloved rose gardens with a minimalist Zen rock garden with water features. "Are you just going to let them erase your father's true memory, without a fight?" "Oh, there will be a fight, my love," I'd replied, a small, humorless smile touching my lips. "But it will not be the fight they are expecting. This will not be a messy, public battle over the legal interpretation of a cruel and bigoted codicil. That would be playing their game on their terms. No, this will be a presentation of historical fact, a quiet academic and entirely devastating recalibration of the entire playing field." My own preparations were, by contrast, discreet, meticulous, and entirely in keeping with my professional habits. I spent my days in the quiet, dusty embrace of archives, the National Archives at Kew, various county record offices, the digital repositories of genealogical societies. I was not just confirming my research. I was triple-checking every source, authenticating every document, building an unassailable, multi-layered fortress of evidence. The core of my discovery, the one that had initiated Project Primogeniture 5 years prior, had been a fluke, a chance encounter while researching a client's lineage in a small parish in rural Devonshire. I had stumbled upon a marriage record from the early 19th century for a Thorne ancestor, a man I knew to be my great-great-grandfather. The record was unremarkable, except for one small, almost invisible annotation in the margin, made by the parish priest in a spidery, faded script. It referred to a previous, unrecorded, hand-fasting ceremony between my great-great-grandfather and a local Romani woman, and the subsequent, discreet, out-of-wedlock birth of a son who had been quietly given to a childless local couple to raise as their own, his true parentage a closely guarded secret. Hand-fasting, a traditional, often informal, form of marriage, was not legally recognized by the Church of England at the time, but the priest's note, a private record of a moral, if not legal, union, had been a tantalizing clue. For a professional genealogist, it was the scent of a hidden history, a suppressed narrative. Over the next 5 years in my spare time, between my professional commitments, I had followed that faint, centuries-old trail with a quiet, obsessive determination. I had traced the story of that secret son, my great-great-grandfather's firstborn, through a labyrinth of census records, baptismal certificates, military service documents, and shipping manifests. He had, it turned out, been a man of remarkable resilience and ambition, who had eventually immigrated to Australia, anglicized his adopted name, and founded his own, surprisingly successful, sheep farming dynasty. He had married, had children, and his line had continued, a whole unknown branch of the Thorne family tree, flourishing forgotten on the other side of the world. But the truly explosive part of my research, the part that would detonate my father's and Caroline's smug, exclusionary sense of their own lineage, was the DNA evidence. Through a discreet, international genealogical research network I was a part of, I had managed to make contact with a direct, living descendant of that secret, firstborn son, a man named Thomas Sterling, a retired sheep farmer in New South Wales, a man who bore a startling, almost comical, resemblance to my own grandfather. Thomas, intrigued by my research, had readily agreed to a DNA test. The results, when I had compared them to my own, had confirmed it beyond any shadow of a doubt. We shared a direct, paternal Y chromosome lineage. We were cousins. He was a Thorne by blood, if not by name. But the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle, the one that elevated my discovery from a mere interesting historical footnote to a potential legal and existential catastrophe for Caroline, was a document I had unearthed in my own father's archives, in the very roll-top desk he had so cherished. Tucked away in a hidden compartment, a place I had only discovered after his passing, was a letter from my great-grandfather to his own solicitor, dated in the late 19th century. In it, he acknowledged the existence of his own father's secret, firstborn son, and expressed his profound guilt over the boy's disinheritance. And then, he had laid out his own secret testamentary wish, that should his own direct line ever fail, or should it ever be proven to have acted in a manner dishonorable to the Thorne name and its true, if complex, history, then the entirety of the Thorne family estate was to revert to the descendants of that firstborn, unacknowledged son. It was a tontine of sorts, a moral and financial time bomb, set to detonate upon a specific and now, arguably, achievable condition, an act of profound dishonor by the recognized heir. My father's codicil, his cruel, bigoted disinheritance of his own son based purely on my sexual orientation, was, I knew Alastair Finch would argue with considerable legal and moral force, precisely such an act. It was an act so fundamentally at odds with modern principles of equity and familial duty that it could be considered a profound dishonor to the family name. The gift I was preparing for my father's memorial was not just a genealogical report. It was a comprehensive legal case, a meticulously documented claim on behalf of the newly discovered and arguably now rightful heirs to the Thorne family estate, Thomas Sterling and his family in Australia. I had been in discreet contact with Thomas and with his own, rather formidable Australian legal counsel. They were aware of the situation, aware of my great-grandfather's secret letter, and were prepared to act to formally contest Caroline's inheritance as soon as I gave them the signal. My father had cut me out of his will, believing he was protecting the purity of his bloodline. He had no idea he had just handed me the very key I needed to unlock a truth that would not just challenge, but completely redefine that bloodline forever. The memorial service, a grand, ostentatious affair Caroline was planning at the local cathedral, was just a week away. It would be a gathering of all my father's friends, his business associates, the pillars of the local community. It was the perfect venue for the presentation of my research. My gift would be delivered quietly, discreetly, in the form of a beautifully bound volume, presented to Caroline just after the service. A volume titled, The True and Complete Genealogy of the Thorne Family, a study in suppressed histories and unexpected legacies. And inside, along with the family trees, the birth certificates, the DNA reports, would be a polite but firm introductory letter from the Australian legal counsel of Mr. Thomas Sterling, the true, and now claimant, senior male heir of the Thorne family. Caroline was planning a memorial to honor the father she thought she knew. She had no idea she was about to be presented with a historical record that would not just dishonor him, but would also, very likely, disinherit her. The genealogist, the disappointment, was about to correct the family tree with a rather large and very sharp legal axe. The week leading up to my father's memorial service was a period of intense, quiet activity, a final, meticulous cross-referencing of my 2 decades of research for Project Primogeniture. I worked with a calm, almost preternatural focus, the skills honed over a lifetime of professional genealogical work, now being deployed in the most personal and most consequential case of my career. Alistair Finch, my own solicitor, had reviewed the entire dossier, his usual dry, professional demeanor giving way to a look of almost boyish glee as he absorbed the full, delicious irony of the situation. "Julian," he'd said, a rare, wide smile on his face, this is not just a legal case. It's a work of art, a masterpiece of historical and legal judo. You are using their own obsession with bloodlines, with legacy, with the sanctity of the family name as the very instrument of their potential downfall. Your great-grandfather's dishonor clause, it's a thing of beauty. And your father's bigoted codicil is, without a doubt, the most profound act of dishonor imaginable. It's perfect, absolutely perfect. I had also been in close communication with Thomas Sterling in New South Wales and his Australian legal team. Thomas, a quiet, decent, and deeply pragmatic man, was still reeling from the discovery of his true ancestry. But he understood, with a sheep farmer's straightforward logic, the fundamental injustice of his own forebears' disinheritance, and the profound, poetic justice of this unexpected opportunity to see that historical wrong righted. He was not a grasping or avaricious man, but he believed in fairness, and he was fully prepared to pursue his and his family's legitimate claim to the Thorne estate. His lawyers, a formidable Sydney-based firm specializing in international probate litigation, were equally enthusiastic, their preliminary assessment being that their case, supported by my meticulous research and my great-grandfather's damning letter, was exceptionally strong. The final piece of my plan was the physical presentation of my gift. I did not want a messy, public confrontation at the memorial service itself. That would be too crude, too un-Julian. My approach was always one of quiet, devastating precision. I had my research professionally bound into a single, magnificent volume, its cover a deep, somber blue, its title embossed in elegant gold leaf, A Genealogical History of the Thorne Family, 1780 present. It looked like a scholarly masterpiece, a fitting tribute to a family so obsessed with its own history. But tucked inside the front cover, of course, would be the polite but legally unambiguous introductory letter from Thomas Sterling's Sydney solicitors, formally notifying Caroline of their client's claim to the Thorne estate, based on the evidence contained within the volume itself. I prepared 2 copies of this volume, one for Caroline, and one which I intended to present with a certain quiet ceremony to Mr. Abernathy, my father's now sideline solicitor, a man whose loyalty to my father, while perhaps misguided, had always been sincere. Abernathy deserved to know the true, complex history of the family he had served for so long. The day of the memorial service arrived, a crisp, cool autumn afternoon. The cathedral was filled to capacity, a testament to my father's standing in the local community, a community that was, of course, entirely unaware of the more problematic aspects of his character. Caroline, as the bereaved daughter and sole heir, played her part with a convincing, if somewhat theatrical, solemnity, her black designer dress a perfect symbol of her newly acquired and deeply felt sense of tragic importance. She delivered a eulogy filled with platitudes about my father's strength, his unwavering principles, his deep commitment to family values. I listened, my expression impassive, the irony so thick it was almost suffocating. My own husband, David, sat beside me, his hand a warm, steady presence on my arm, a silent anchor in this sea of hypocrisy. After the service, as the guests milled about, offering condolences to Caroline, I approached her. She saw me coming, her expression momentarily tightening, a flicker of her old, dismissive annoyance in her eyes. "Julian," she said, her voice a little cooler now that the public performance of grief was over. "I trust you found the service appropriate." "It was very well attended, Caroline," I replied, my voice neutral. "I have something for you. A gift. In memory of Dad." I thought, given his deep appreciation for our family history, that he would have wanted you to have this. I then presented her with the beautifully bound blue volume. She took it, a look of surprised and slightly suspicious curiosity on her face. A book? A history of the family? She opened it, her eyes scanning the table of contents, the meticulously drawn family trees, the reproductions of old photographs and documents. Her expression softened slightly, a flicker of genuine interest, perhaps even a touch of vanity at seeing her own lineage so magnificently documented. "Well, Julian," she said, her voice a little less frosty, this is actually quite thoughtful of you. Surprisingly so. I do hope you'll read it carefully, Caroline," I said, my voice still quiet, my gaze direct. "Particularly the introductory chapter. I believe you'll find a section on our great-great-grandfather and his previously unrecorded issue to be of particular, and perhaps rather urgent, interest." I saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes, but before she could question me further, I offered her a small, enigmatic smile, and turned away, leaving her with my Trojan horse of a gift, its devastating contents waiting to be discovered. I then sought out Mr. Abernathy, who was standing alone, looking rather lost amidst the chattering crowds. I presented him with the second copy of the volume. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, "I believe this might help to clarify some of the more complex aspects of my father's true legacy. A legacy that, I fear, he himself did not fully comprehend." Abernathy took the book, his old, tired eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and a dawning, scholarly curiosity. He, unlike Caroline, would understand its implications immediately. My work was done. The seeds of historical truth, of genealogical reality, had been sown. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to germinate, to break through the carefully manicured topsoil of my family's long-held illusions and convenient fictions. The after-service reception was being held at my parents' house, the house that was now, temporarily, Caroline's. I had, of course, not been invited, but I knew that sooner or later, likely after the last of the condolence offers had departed, Caroline would sit down with my gift, and her world, her smug, secure, and entirely unearned world, would, with the simple turning of a page, begin to unravel. The disinherited son, the family disappointment, had just delivered his own, rather unique, eulogy. A eulogy written not in platitudes, but in facts. And the inheritance he was about to unleash upon his sister was not one of wealth, but of a truth so profound, so devastating, that would redefine the Thorne family name forever. The call from Caroline came late that night, long after the last of the memorial service guests had departed, leaving her alone in the vast, silent house she believed she had so cleverly secured as her own. Her voice, when I finally answered on the fourth ring, was not the imperious, condescending tone I was so accustomed to. It was a raw, ragged sound, a discordant symphony of fury, disbelief, and a dawning, visceral terror. "Julian, what is this poison? This fabrication you gave me? A succession? An Australian sheep farmer? Are you insane? This is a lie. A monstrous, vicious lie." I listened calmly, picturing her in Dad's old study, the beautifully bound blue volume open before her, its meticulously documented contents a stark, irrefutable refutation of her entire worldview. "It's not a lie, Caroline," I replied, my voice quiet, almost clinical. "It's a genealogical fact. A rather inconvenient one for you, I'll grant you, but a fact nonetheless. Supported by birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, shipping manifests, and of course a 99.9999% positive Y chromosome DNA match between myself and our second cousin, 3 times removed, Mr. Thomas Sterling of New South Wales. The mention of DNA, of cold, hard, scientific proof, seemed to momentarily stun her into silence. The language of verifiable data was not one she was comfortable with. Her preferred currency was emotion, insinuation, and social pressure. In Dad's letter, she finally managed, her voice a choked whisper. The one from great-grandfather? That can't be real. Oh, it's quite real, Caroline, I said. Authenticated by 2 independent handwriting experts, and its provenance confirmed by its discovery in a hidden compartment of a desk whose construction predates both our births. A compartment, I might add, that your cursory appraisal of the house's contents somehow managed to overlook. But even if it's true, she stammered, her mind clearly racing, trying to find a foothold in the crumbling edifice of her inheritance. It doesn't mean anything. Dad's last will, the one that disinherited you and left everything to me, that's the one that matters. It's the most recent. It supersedes everything else. Ah, I said, and I confess, a small, cold sliver of satisfaction pierced my otherwise calm demeanor. That is where you, in your rather expensive but clearly not very thorough solicitor, Mr. Thorne, have made a critical miscalculation. You see, Caroline, great-grandfather's letter wasn't a will. It was a directive attached to the very trust that forms the bulk of the Thorne family estate. A directive that established shall we say, a moral and ethical contingency clause. The dishonor clause. I could almost hear the frantic whirring of her mind on the other end of the line. Dishonor clause? Indeed. It stipulates that should the designated primary heir of his line, in this case, our father, and subsequently his designated heir, you act in a manner deemed by the independent trustees of the estate to be profoundly dishonorable to the family name and its true history, then the line of inheritance is to be considered broken, and the estate is to revert to the descendants of his firstborn, albeit unacknowledged, son, which would be, of course, Mr. Thomas Sterling and his family. That's ridiculous, she shrieked. What's dishonorable? Who decides that? Well, Caroline, I said, my voice still quiet, almost conversational, I believe that a court of law, when presented with a codicil to a will that explicitly disinherits a man's own son for no other reason than his sexual orientation, a codicil my father was clearly pressured into signing in his final, vulnerable months by you and your advisors, might be persuaded to consider that a rather profound and legally actionable act of dishonor, an act that directly triggers the very contingency our great-grandfather, a man clearly more forward-thinking than his descendants, had the foresight to put in place. The silence on the other end of the line was now so profound I could hear the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the connection. The full, catastrophic implications of her actions, of my father's final act of bigotry, were finally beginning to dawn on her. And just to be clear, Caroline, I added, delivering the coup de grace, the introductory letter in the volume I gave you, the one you perhaps overlooked in your haste to get to the more salacious genealogical details, was not from me. It was from the Sydney-based legal firm of Atherton, Croft, and Hayes, the duly appointed representatives of Mr. Thomas Sterling. It serves as their formal notification of their client's intention to file a legal claim on the entirety of the Thorne family estate, based on the aforementioned dishonor clause and the irrefutable evidence of his lineage. Their preliminary filing with the International Probate Court is scheduled for next week. The sound that came from Caroline's end was a low, wounded moan, the sound of a life of unearned privilege, of smug certainty, of effortless entitlement, imploding in real time. She had thought, by colluding with our father in his final, cruel act of prejudice, that she was securing her own future, cementing her place as the sole inheritor of the Thorne legacy. Instead, she had, with a beautiful, almost poetic irony, triggered the very mechanism that was now poised to strip her of everything. Her greed, her ambition, her casual cruelty had not just disinherited me. It had, in a final, spectacular twist of historical fate, disinherited herself. "If you did this, Julian," she finally whispered, her voice a ragged ruin. "You planned this. All of it." "No, Caroline," I replied, and my voice was not triumphant, but weary, filled with the quiet sadness of a historian contemplating the predictable and often tragic follies of human nature. "I didn't do this. You and Dad and your shared, small-minded prejudices did this to yourselves. I simply did the research. I uncovered the truth." The historical record, as it turns out, has a rather powerful and often deeply ironic way of asserting itself. I then ended the call, leaving her to the silence of that vast, empty house, a house that was, in all likelihood, no longer hers to renovate, to sell, or to inhabit. The genealogist had presented his findings. The suppressed history had been brought to light, and the true, complex, and now legally contested legacy of the Thorne family was about to be adjudicated, not by prejudice or entitlement, but by the cold, hard, and unassailable facts of its own, long-forgotten history. The gift had been delivered, and its repercussions, I knew, would echo for generations. The legal battle for the Thorne family estate was, as Alastair Finch had predicted, protracted, complex, and for Caroline, utterly devastating. The Sydney-based legal team representing Thomas Sterling, armed with my meticulous genealogical research and my great-grandfather's damning letter, filed their claim with a quiet, implacable efficiency that clearly rattled Caroline's own, rather out-of-his-depth, local solicitor. The case hinged on the interpretation of the dishonor clause, a unique and archaic piece of legal drafting that sent probate lawyers on both sides of the globe scurrying to their dusty law books. Alastair Finch, who I had retained to act as a consultant and expert witness on the historical and legal context of the trust, was in his element, his courtroom performance a masterclass in scholarly precision and understated legal savagery. The proceedings, held in a series of tense, private hearings before a special probate master, became a slow, methodical deconstruction of my father and Caroline's actions. The codicil disinheriting me, when presented in court, was seen for what it was, a cruel, bigoted, and ultimately self-defeating act of familial betrayal. Caroline's attempt to portray our father as a man of unwavering traditional principles fell flat when Alastair presented evidence of his many failed and often ethically dubious business ventures, and my own testimony regarding his lifelong pattern of emotional neglect and conditional affection. The DNA evidence, of course, was unassailable. Thomas Sterling, the quiet sheep farmer from New South Wales, was, beyond any shadow of a doubt, a direct descendant of the Thorne patriarch. His claim to the bloodline, the very thing my father had held so sacred, now scientifically and legally irrefutable. The final verdict, when it came nearly a year later, was a landmark ruling. The probate master, a formidable woman with a keen appreciation for historical justice, found in favor of Thomas Sterling. She ruled that my father's codicil, in its explicit and malicious exclusion of his own son based purely on his sexual orientation, constituted an act so profoundly dishonorable and contrary to the principles of natural justice that it had indeed triggered the long-dormant contingency clause in my great-grandfather's trust. The line of inheritance, as established through my father, was declared legally broken. The entirety of the Thorne family estate, the house, the investments, the assets Caroline had so confidently believed were hers, was awarded to its newly discovered, and now legally recognized, rightful heirs, Thomas Sterling and his family. Caroline was left with nothing, less than nothing, in fact, as the court also ordered her to pay a significant portion of the Sterling family's not inconsiderable legal costs. Her life of unearned privilege, her dreams of becoming the grand matriarch of a landed dynasty, had evaporated, a casualty of her own greed and her father's posthumous prejudice. She was forced to sell the family home, the one she had been so eager to renovate, to cover her debts. She retreated from public life, a diminished, embittered figure, her social standing in ruins, her future a landscape of significantly reduced circumstances. I heard, through the grapevine, that she had eventually divorced Gerald, her equally avaricious but ultimately less resilient husband, who had apparently not taken well to the sudden and dramatic downturn in their financial fortunes. As for me, my life, and my relationship with my husband, David, continued on its quiet, satisfying course. I had asked for nothing from the estate settlement, seeking neither financial gain nor legal retribution. My victory was of a different, more profound nature. It was the victory of truth over prejudice, of historical fact over self-serving fiction. It was the quiet, satisfying vindication of a life lived with integrity, a life my father had so cruelly dismissed. My greatest reward, however, was the unexpected and deeply moving relationship that developed between my family and the newly discovered Australian branch of the Thorns. Thomas Sterling, upon taking possession of his unexpected inheritance, did something that spoke volumes about his character. He flew to London, where David and I lived, to meet us in person. He was a quiet, unassuming man, his hands weathered from a lifetime of hard work, his eyes filled with a kind, steady wisdom. He brought with him a small, beautifully crafted wooden box made from Australian eucalyptus. My great-grandfather, the one who was raised by another family, Thomas said, his voice thick with a quiet emotion. He was a carpenter, a skill he passed down through our line. He never knew his true name, his true heritage, but he built a good life, an honest life, on the other side of the world. He would have wanted you to have this, I think, as a thank you for setting the record straight. Inside the box was not money, not a legal document, but a single, perfectly preserved, dried eucalyptus leaf. It sent a faint, earthy reminder of a land and a family I had never known, but to whom I was now inextricably and rather wonderfully linked. We became firm friends, Thomas and I. We corresponded regularly, sharing stories, photographs, the slowly unfolding tapestry of our two, long-separated, families. David and I even traveled to Australia to visit him on his sheep station, a vast, sun-drenched landscape so different from the cool, gray skies of England, yet filled with the same enduring values of hard work, integrity, and the quiet, unshakable bonds of true family. The gift my father had intended as his final, cruel rejection of me had, in a beautiful and unexpected twist of fate, become the catalyst for the greatest gift of all, the discovery of a new family, a new history, a new understanding of the complex, often surprising, and ultimately deeply resilient nature of a bloodline. The Thorne family legacy had not been ended by my father's prejudice. It had been redefined, expanded, and, in its own way, made whole again. The genealogist, the disappointment, had not just corrected the family tree. He had helped it to grow a whole new and infinitely more honorable branch. And that, I knew, was a legacy my great-grandfather, a man who had understood the true meaning of both honor and regret, would have been profoundly proud of. The years following the momentous legal victory and the subsequent, and rather joyful, discovery of my Australian cousins were a period of quiet, profound, and entirely welcome recalibration. My life with David, already a bedrock of love and mutual respect, deepened even further, no longer shadowed by the subtle but persistent chill of my father's disapproval. We continued our work, I with my genealogical research, he with his thriving architectural practice, our home a sanctuary of books, art, and the comfortable, easy rhythm of a shared life well lived. The Marion Harrison Foundation, the charitable entity I had established with a portion of my own, independently earned, wealth flourished. Its mission, to support LGBTQ+ youth who had been disowned or disadvantaged by their families, took on a new, more personal resonance for me. It became a way to transform the pain of my own experience into a positive, supportive force in the lives of others, a way to build a different kind of legacy, one based not on bloodlines or inherited wealth, but on compassion, on acceptance, on the simple, radical act of providing a safe harbor for those who had been cast adrift by prejudice. My relationship with Thomas Sterling and his family in Australia became one of the great joys of my later life. We visited each other regularly, our children and grandchildren forging their own connections, the two long-separated branches of the Thorne family tree grafting together with a surprising and heartwarming ease. The Thorne estate, under Thomas's quiet, sensible stewardship, was managed with a prudence and integrity that would have made my great-grandfather, and indeed, my own long-suffering mother, proud. A significant portion of its income was directed towards charitable causes, both in Australia and in the UK, a quiet but powerful refutation of the selfish, grasping avarice that had so nearly consumed it. Of Caroline, my sister, I heard very little. Her fall from grace had been as swift as it had been comprehensive. Stripped of her inheritance, her social standing, and eventually her long-suffering husband, Gerald, she had reportedly retreated into a life of quiet, embittered obscurity, a lonely figure in a small, rented flat, her days a monotonous cycle of regret and resentment. I felt no triumph in her decline, only a weary sadness for a life so comprehensively squandered in the pursuit of such empty, superficial goals. The beautiful, leather-bound volume, A Genealogical History of the Thorne Family, the one that had served as the catalyst for this entire drama, now resided in a place of honor in my study. It was no longer a weapon, but a testament to the enduring power of truth, to the unexpected twists of history, and to the quiet, meticulous, and often overlooked work of the genealogist, the archivist, the keeper of stories. It was a reminder that the past, however deeply buried, however deliberately suppressed, always, eventually, finds a way to speak. And its voice, when finally heard, can be a force of profound, and often deeply ironic, justice. One crisp autumn afternoon, many years later, as David and I were enjoying a quiet cup of tea in our garden, a courier arrived with an unexpected package. It was from a firm of solicitors in Sydney I didn't recognize. Inside, there was a letter informing me that Thomas Sterling, my dear Australian cousin, had passed away peacefully at the age of 89 after a long and fulfilling life. The letter went on to inform me that Thomas, in his own will, had made a rather surprising bequest. He had left a significant portion of his own, not inconsiderable, estate to the Marion Harrison Foundation, my charitable endeavor, with a simple, handwritten note attached. For Julian, it read, in Thomas's strong, clear script, who gave us back our past, and in doing so, helped us to build a better future for generations of Thornes and Sterlings to come. With love and gratitude, your cousin Tom. Tears welled in my eyes as I read his words. It was a final, beautiful, and entirely unexpected act of kinship, a closing of a circle that had begun with an act of cruel disinheritance and had ended with an act of profound and deeply moving generosity. My father, in his bigotry, had tried to cut me out of my family's story. But in doing so, he had inadvertently opened the door to a much larger, much richer, and infinitely more compassionate version of what that family could be. His gift of rejection had become, in the end, the greatest gift of all. It had given me not just a legal victory, not just a sense of personal vindication, but a whole new family, a whole new history, a whole new understanding of the complex, resilient, and often wonderfully surprising ways in which the roots of a family tree can find their way back to the light, even after centuries of darkness. The final accounting on the long and complex ledger of the Thorne family was one of quiet, profound, and entirely unexpected grace. And that, for a dusty old genealogist, was a historical record more precious than any title, any estate, any earthly treasure. It was quite simply everything. The legacy of Thomas Sterling's generous bequest to the Marion Harrison Foundation was transformative. It allowed us to expand our outreach exponentially, to establish safe houses for homeless LGBTQ+ youth, to fund university scholarships, to create mentorship programs that paired young people with established professionals in their chosen fields. It was a gift that kept on giving, a ripple of kindness and justice spreading outwards from a single, cruel act of prejudice so many years ago. The irony was not lost on me. My father's attempt to punish me for my lifestyle had, in the end, resulted in the creation of a powerful and enduring resource for thousands of young people who had faced similar and often far worse forms of familial rejection. It was a form of posthumous, unintentional philanthropy he could never have envisioned, and one that brought me a deep, quiet satisfaction. My own life, with David, settled into a peaceful, golden autumn. We traveled, we gardened, we read, we enjoyed the simple, profound pleasures of a long and loving companionship. The ghosts of the past, of my father's disapproval, of Caroline's avarice, had long since faded, their power to wound extinguished by the steady, gentle light of a life well lived, a life built on integrity, on love, and on the quiet, unshakable foundations of our shared home. One day, while sorting through a box of old family photographs, I came across a faded, sepia-toned portrait of my great-great-grandfather, the Thorne patriarch whose secret, firstborn son had been the key to unraveling my own family's carefully constructed fictions. He stared out from the photograph with a stern, Victorian visage, a man of his time, bound by its conventions, its prejudices. And yet, tucked away in his own private papers, he had left a legacy of conscience, a moral time bomb that had ticked silently for over a century before finally detonating, just when it was needed most. I thought about the complex, often contradictory, nature of legacy. My father had sought to leave a legacy of purity, of tradition, of a narrow, exclusionary vision of the family name. Instead, his legacy had become one of bigotry, of a cruelty so profound it had resulted in the very outcome he had most feared, the loss of his family's ancestral estate. My great-grandfather, by contrast, had left a legacy of quiet remorse, of a desire for a justice he knew he could not achieve in his own lifetime, but which he had, with remarkable foresight, entrusted to the conscience of future generations. And I will my legacy be, not just the foundation, not just the successful legal battle, not just the meticulous genealogical research. My true legacy, I hoped, was embodied in my relationship with David, in the life of quiet authenticity we had built together, in our unwavering commitment to love, to partnership, to mutual respect, a testament to the fact that a family is not defined by bloodlines or conventions, but by the bonds of affection and loyalty that we choose to forge, that we choose to honor. It was about proving, not with anger or with rhetoric, but with the quiet, irrefutable evidence of a happy, fulfilling life, that my father's definition of a man, of a family, of a life of value, had been not just wrong, but tragically, profoundly small. The gift he had given me, the one he had intended as a curse, as his final, damning judgment, had, in the end, been the key that had unlocked my own, truer, and far more expansive destiny. It had led me to a new family, a new history, a new purpose. It had been a gift of profound, if entirely unintentional, grace.